The last speaker in this quite incredible session is Bill Lawrence. Bill probably doesn't need an introduction. He is such a distinguished figure in our field, but Bill is the Distinguished Research Professor at James Cook University in Cairns, Australia. He is also has a chair at Utrecht University. Hopefully I've got that right. He probably needs a bookcase for all the awards that he has won in his distinguished career, and another 2 or 3 bookcases for the books he's written. Bill is going to talk to us about Infrastructure Armageddon.
Okay, well, thanks, folks. Just letting you know, I've actually got a bit of extra time, so I've got an extra 15 minutes, so don't think if I'm just gone walkabout on the talk. It's really exciting to be here at Oxford and seeing the novel and cutting-edge stuff happening here. Some of which I was aware of, a lot of which I wasn't, and I think you've really got a tiger, pardon the metaphor, but you've got a tiger by the tail, and you're doing some very exciting things. I'm looking forward to seeing a journal of conservation geopolitics in the very near future, because I think it certainly merits things. I want to start by noting that I'm wearing a blue shirt. Psychologists have actually found that if you want to convince people that you're telling them the truth, that wearing the color blue it works well. So I'm doing this on purpose. It's one of a number of issues I have with Donald Trump. I've never seen him in a blue anything, but I'm going to make a series of arguments and assertions and propositions that I think some people will find debatable, so I'm just letting you know that up front. But it's a particular line of thinking and a particular line of thought, and it's going to be around infrastructure and some of its consequences and some of the things that we can potentially do about it. Now, as you all know, you can't pick up a newspaper or go online or turn on your television or listen to radio or anything without hearing about infrastructure. It's one of these issues that has really transcended, technical speak into now everybody's talking about it. And people have really begun to realize how transformative it is. I would actually argue that the modern tsunami of infrastructure that we're experiencing right now, if you wanted to pick a single proximate human activity, is probably the most important and transformative change that's happening now and in the next few decades. This is going to change the Earth more dramatically than anything that we've really talked about. And if you look at what's happening to the planet, and Kate made an interesting allusion to the collapse of wildlife populations, but if you look at wilderness, if you look at connectivity, if you look at environmental quality, if you look at almost any range of indicators, what you see is it is the frontiers that are being peeled back and disrupted and altered by this explosion of infrastructure across the planet. Just for example, the roads, by the middle part of this century, 2050, it's projected that we're going to have something like 25 million kilometers of new paved roads, that's just paved roads, on the planet, which is enough to encircle the Earth more than 600 times. We tend to spend a lot of time talking about roads because in many ways they link different kinds of infrastructure. But of course, when we're talking about infrastructure, we're talking about transportation projects, we're talking about energy projects, we're talking about water projects, we're talking about a whole range of things. But in many ways, roads are almost the common denominator, or at least transportation infrastructure. Because, for instance, you can't have a major mining project or a hydroelectric project or any of these other kinds of projects. It's nearly impossible to develop one of these types of things without having roads, for instance, for transportation and for all the things associated with it. So, for instance, in the Amazon basin, there's now currently plans afoot for more than 300 major hydroelectric dams within the main tributaries and various contributing tributaries of the Amazon River and in the Andean Piedmont. And these are going to profoundly change the Amazon ecosystem. And one of the reasons is because you absolutely can't build a hydroelectric dam without roads and also clearings for high-tension power lines in order to transport all those thousands of tons of concrete and all the material that you need to maintain the project and to construct the project. And you can see here, for example, this is one dam in Brazil, Tucuruí. This was essentially a forested area with some indigenous peoples and low populations when the dam was built. There's the footprint of the dam now, and you can see what it looks like today. So that project has had an enormous dragging effect, and it's as a consequence of the initial infrastructure, particularly the roads that were built to create that project. So really, one of the key reasons that we're talking about roads and other kinds of infrastructure, but transportation infrastructure particularly, is because they oftentimes are so transformative. They just about change everything. The economic dynamics, the political dynamics, the land use dynamics, the environmental dynamics, just about everything are altered. And they're connected. And so we can't readily disentangle different kinds of infrastructure. Again, I'm going to talk a lot about transportation infrastructure, especially roads, but they're interlinked because the hydroelectric dams and the extractive industry projects and the logging projects and the mining projects, oil and gas projects, are providing the economic impetus for virtually all of that transportation infrastructure expansion and the environmental consequences that follow on from that. Now, one of the really key things is that when we talk about infrastructure, of course, most of this is happening, by definition, in developing nations, around 9/10 of it. Now, absolutely nobody can argue with the notion that developing nations don't need to develop economically and socially and in other ways. And I've been working for almost 40 years now in developing countries all around the world, and you can't even get in the room and start the conversation and carry on any kind of coherent dialogue without absolutely coming up front, with a couple of key assumptions. One is that developing nations need to develop, and second is that they've got an absolute sovereign right to do so and to essentially make their own decisions. So everything that we talk about is within that framework and within those implicit assumptions. But that having been said, the world is changing at an incredible pace, and it is happening mostly in the tropics and the subtropics, which of course we know are the biologically richest and environmentally most important real estate on the planet. So the changes are happening in places that we really care about. And this is just one example. The Congo Basin, I grew up reading, Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness and thinking about, the Congo as one of the great wilderness areas of the world. If we look at the Congo today, or actually this is a study by Nadine Laporte and colleagues in 2007, they found that within about the last decade that there was about 50,000 kilometers of new road building, and in fact, even if you zoom in and look at areas that superficially don't seem to have any roads, and you look at higher resolution, you see that in fact there's a lot of logging roads there. We've just repeated this analysis, and we found that in the decades since the study was published, there's been essentially a doubling of the amount of roads within the Congo Basin. So this has had incredible environmental effects. One of the consequences of many is that, for instance, forest elephants, which are found only within the closed canopy forests of equatorial Africa, the global population of forest elephants has collapsed by about 2/3 within a period of 10 years. And it's a consequence of this explosion of road building activity in concert with the much more lethal technologies, of course, which people have now, which are things like automatic weapons and wire and cable snares, which are just completely ubiquitous. So this stuff is changing the world in a rapid way, and it's having a lot of consequences. I want to talk a little bit about roads and some of the things that we obviously know and some of their direct effects, but also some of their indirect effects. We know, for instance, obviously, when you build a road, you're going to get some habitat loss. So this is, for instance, a road for a gold mine in Panama, and there's a couple dozen meters of habitat destruction that's occurred as a consequence of building that road. That's obvious. Also, we know that particularly in things like closed canopy tropical forests, but in many other kinds of environments, there are big halos of environmental change that radiate out when we juxtapose two completely physically different environments. So we have, for instance, here a dense rainforest, which is tens of millions of years old. It's very humid, it has very little light, very little wind, buffered, quite stable temperatures, buffered microclimatic conditions. And you juxtapose that with a highway, which has a much harsher and more variable, more windy, much higher light, much more higher temperatures, microclimatic conditions, and it's inevitable when you put those two very physically different environments next to each other that you're going to get this series of edge effects or spillover effects. And this is work that we've been involved with for about the last 25 years or so, and many others in the fragmentation project in the central Amazon. Here would be the road or a clearing, and these are various studies showing the diversity and variety of different kinds of edge effects. And they include biotic changes and abiotic changes and alterations in disturbance regimes and declines of forest interior species and invasions of exotic species. But what you can see is just how diverse and also really how large the spatial scale is of a lot of these different environmental changes. A lot of these things are, is there a reason why this is suddenly, oh, because my finger's in the way. You can see how many, in some cases, some of these changes are penetrating hundreds of meters into forest interiors. So when we build a road, we're not just altering a few dozen meters. We can be altering a much larger halo of environments around that. Roads have other kinds of direct consequences, of course. Roadkill is one of the most obvious ones. Some of the more recent demographic models suggest that when you get certain kinds of species that are vulnerable to roadkill, and then if you get relatively high road densities, in fact, roads can become a very important part of population decline, a driver of population decline, analogous to the ecological trap idea that we heard mentioned before. Barrier effects, this is actually some work from my wife's PhD in the Amazon. Very interestingly, they found that there's a whole suites of highly specialized understory insect-eating birds. These birds live on a single territory their entire life. They mate with one individual their entire life. They have an incredible fidelity to their territory. You can capture one of these birds and you can put a tag on it or a radio collar, and you can move it 2 or 3 kilometers inside the rainforest, and every single time that they did this experiment, it returned back to its territory within the same day or within the next day, 100% of the time. They then found that if you move that bird across a 100-meter wide forest clearing, which is about what would be associated with a major highway without any additional changes, that many species of these highly specialized birds would go up and down the clearings and would not return to the territories. And you cannot imagine a circumstance in which a wildlife and the individual species would have a more powerful motivation to move. So if that happens with some species, I mean, that means, there's a giant difference between a little bit of movement and no movement at all. I mean, what we're really talking about here is shutting down dispersal, shutting down demographic flow, shutting down gene flow. That is really a serious consequence of road building and of actual habitat fragmentation. It's telling us that we can well and truly fragment populations, in some cases, of highly specialized species. But then we get into all the secondary effects of roads, and actually, I would argue that these are, in many instances, more important than the primary effects. And of course, one of the obvious ones is hunting, and almost everywhere we look, in developing nations, for instance, we see very strong associations between road access or physical access and hunting intensity. This is just one example here. This is an elephant skeleton that we found at a park in the northern Congo Basin. And this is it has the classical signature of poachers. It's had its face chopped off, okay? So ivory poachers, this was probably killed with automatic rifles, and the poachers chopped off the face because they want to get the base of the tusks out. Of course, and that's why, of course, the elephants are being slaughtered. So this kind of phenomenon is happening, and also, of course, again, with the incredible cheapness and ubiquity of wire and cable. Snares are very strongly associated with road networks. Deforestation, there's an incredible statistical association between roads and forest destruction, and of course things like greenhouse gases, which are associated with forest loss. In some years ago, we did an analysis in the Amazon where we looked at the relationship between deforestation and roads, but one of the things that we didn't actually take into account at the time is we used the legal road maps. And we repeated the analysis and we thought maybe we actually should also look at the illegal roads. And one of the things that we found is that when we actually mapped out laboriously all those illegal roads, one thing we found is that there were about 3 kilometers of illegal road for every 1 kilometer of legal road. And another thing is that we found out that when you mapped all those roads, and you actually know where all the roads are, what you found is not there's a pretty strong statistical relationship here, but this tightens up incredibly. So what we found was that, in fact, in the Amazon basin, 95% of all forest destruction occurs within 5.5 kilometers of a legal or illegal road. Okay, 95% within 5.5 kilometers. That is an incredibly, I mean, if you ask an environmental scientist if you can predict deforestation with that much power with a single variable, so if you want to know where deforestation is going to happen, if you want to plan it, if you want to manage it, if you want to avoid it, it's all about roads. It's all about physical accessibility. I mean, this is why, one of the reasons why, after 40 years of studying environmental change in the tropics, that we converge on the notion of transportation infrastructure. There's a reason driving it. And of course, greenhouse gas emissions, tropical forest destruction and fragmentation is a very important source of emissions. It's probably equivalent to maybe 12, 15% of the global human anthropogenic emissions, which is equivalent to about the global, equivalent of the global total transportation sector. Now, the 9,000-pound gorilla in the corner when you're talking about infrastructure, of course, is China's Belt and Road initiative, which has been discussed very, very widely in lots of realms, and you can't, literally, also can't go online or pick up a paper without hearing more news about the Belt and Road. But just very quickly, so I think everybody knows most of this, the Belt and Road was initially envisaged and promoted and developed within China as emulating some of the old Silk Road routes between China and Europe, but also including South Asia and the Middle East. And then also parts of Africa. It has major sea lanes associated with it. It subsequently, as of about 14 months ago, has been expanded very considerably in scope to include also Central and South America and the Caribbean region, and also the Arctic region, and with major sea lanes increasingly being opened up because of global warming, and there are a lot of transportation infrastructure, ports, and also railroads and roads and other projects associated with moving cargo and goods across the northern polar route. And so now the Belt and Road encompasses much of the planet. China is also, incidentally, overwhelmingly the largest investor in Antarctica. And I predict, in fact, in terms of infrastructure and other kinds of things happening, I expect China's footprint of economic activity to include activities within the Antarctic very soon. And this would include things like mineral resources and fisheries and that type of thing. That's a conversation that's going to happen quickly. China, in terms of the amount of skin, the amount of money that China has in the game right now, and sorry, I should have just quickly mentioned, right now, the Belt and Road project, using the best available information, is going to spans 130 nations worldwide. There's over 7,000 projects, and these are major infrastructure and extractive industry projects associated with the project, and a total projected budget, and these numbers are quite rough, of around $8 trillion, $8 trillion US dollars, which is very serious money. In terms of sort of global economic factors. China's total direct investment in the Belt and Road is on the order of about $1 trillion, and this is something that many people don't realize. In fact, the expectation of China and many of the people associated with the Belt and Road is that roughly 7/8 of the investment is going to come from other sources outside of China. And this would include a wide range. It includes the host nations, but also includes a very wide range of global financiers. So this would be everything from the multilateral banks to the commercial banks to corporations large and small to individual billionaires to the different investment funds, mutual funds, insurance funds, that type of thing. So infrastructure is a huge growth industry from the perspective of the global financial industry. But a key thing to remember is that China, in fact, with the Belt and Road, which is not by any means the only game in town, but it's overwhelmingly the single largest game in town, China, in fact, is only bearing about 1/8 of the total economic burden of this world-changing initiative. And I think that'll come back and have some interesting implications. Now, China, in producing the Belt and Road Initiative has produced an absolute rain of white papers and different kinds of documents and different kinds of policy initiatives, and there's many. I mean, the Chinese Academy of Sciences has a whole range of different kinds of projects that they've put out, multidisciplinary and other kinds of projects. There's been initiatives around green credits, environmental and social guidelines, and it's been embodied, if you listen to the language around it, very much in a sort of sustainable philosophy, if you sort of take it at face value. And one of the things that I wanted to do is to try to, in this very complex milieu of change going on that we're all dealing with, is to try to look at this through the prism of a single species, which in this case happens to be the most endangered species of great ape on the planet. Now, this was only recently described scientifically just a couple years ago. It's the Tapanuli orangutan, and it occurs only in a tiny area of Sumatra, Indonesia. So this, again, this was formerly thought to be, it was formerly thought there were two species of orangutan, the Bornean and the Sumatran orangutan. It now turns out that there's three. And this one, this Tapanuli orangutan's global population has definitely contracted dramatically. It's currently has a geographic range, known range of about 1,200 square kilometers, which is about a tenth the size of Sydney, Australia, for example. There's less than 800 individuals alive, and again, it's the world's rarest great ape. It's also the world's most ecologically specialized great ape. For example, of all the different the 8 species of great apes, the orangutans are the most arboreal, and the Tapanuli orangutan is the most arboreal of all the orangutans. In fact, in 3,000 hours of observations, it's never been seen on the ground alive. Okay, that's the only time you see them on the ground is when they're dead. So, an animal that's very specialized in its ecology and biology. We did an analysis last year where we looked at its geographic range and the land use patterns and what's going on. And what we found, of course, is that it occurs within a very small area. Its habitat is becoming increasingly fragmented, and there's quite a number of different threats that are influencing the population, and the overall prognosis is pretty alarming. But overwhelmingly, the largest threat to the survival of the Tapanuli orangutan is a major hydroelectric project, the Batang Toru hydro project, which is part of the Belt and Road. Okay, so this in some senses, we're looking at this closely in some sense as an exemplar of the kinds of things that might happen with the Belt and Road Initiative and in terms of these kinds of the philosophy of how it's being developed. So the project itself is about $1.6 billion, which actually in terms of hydro project budgets is not overwhelmingly large. In fact, this has among the lowest efficiencies in terms of kilowatts produced per dollar of any major energy project. The key things about this is that what it will do is it will essentially drive a vertical sort of corridor of destruction right through the heart of the largest remaining population of the Tapanuli orangutan. And this will include 14 kilometers of roads, but also clearings for high-tension power lines, and major underground waterways, sort of 10-meter diameter pipes, which would be comparable to some of the major sections, for instance, of the London Underground. It's being very much supported by Sinohydro, which is China's national hydroelectric authority, and it's being funded by the Bank of China and by other Chinese financiers, with a little bit of investment from Indonesia, but almost entirely by Chinese, by a range of Chinese financiers, especially the Bank of China. And so this overall, in terms of any kind of demographic analysis, of which there have been population viability analyses done, this is overwhelmingly the biggest threat to the survival of this critically, and this is a very critically endangered species. So there's been, perhaps not surprisingly, a very concerted campaign led by scientists about this ape. I mean, the uniqueness of it and its incredible rarity and its incredible vulnerability. And there's been a variety of groups, Alert, the group that I lead, but also many other groups, including Friends of the Earth and WALI, which is the largest conservation group in Indonesia, a number of very important groups like the Sumatran Orangutan Conservation Program. Avaaz, for instance, started up a petition against this project, and within 1 week they had 1.3 million signatures. I mean, just to give you an idea of the scientific and public relations and other kinds of effort that have gone into trying to influence this particular conservation issue are more intense and more focused than anything I've seen, I think, in my entire career. And there's been a number of high-profile investigative reports that have come out about this. So the question is, well, what's happening? And again, this is this ape that just essentially survives in this little tiny valley. Oh, another consequence that I didn't mention is actually this river flow will be essentially completely halted. And so in addition to the roads and the power lines, and we know that virtually everywhere in Indonesia, whenever there's physical access, you get poaching and encroachment and other kinds of activities, often illegal activities, and they happen almost inevitably as a consequence of these kinds of things. And the other thing that we know in our analysis that we did with the Tapanuli orangutan is the one key thing that predicted its distribution was roads. Where roads occur, it does not occur. Okay. So, but one other thing that's going to happen, in addition to all the infrastructure that we talked about, is that this river, the flow of this river for 18 hours a day is going to be completely halted. And so, in fact, if you're a poacher, you could literally just walk in along the riverbed itself, because there'll be just a trickle of water coming down the river itself. So what I want to do is talk about some concerns around the Belt and Road Initiative, given that what's happened, excuse me, let's go back for a second to digress. What's happened in response to this very concerted campaign has been, I mean, words almost fail me, but I will tell you that I have been quoted on the record as referring to a number of the activities as essentially criminal in nature by the proponents and by various others that are involved in this particular project. And they go from we know now, complete falsification of key elements of the environmental impact assessment in North Sumatra, suppression of key information that completely changes the interpretation of the EIA, buying off or paying off or pressuring many of the scientists that are involved in this particular project. We know two of the largest newspapers, the reporters from the South China Morning Post and the Jakarta Post, have told us that they've been very strongly pressured not to write anything negative issues about this particular project. The proponents have done things like they've gone out and hired 2 different public relations firms, one of which specializes in corporate crisis management. Those PR firms, in fact, have actually changed the game, because initially the momentum was moving towards stopping this project. And in fact, it's not stopped at all. The bulldozers are roaring away literally right now. The project is going ahead absolutely full speed. For the very first time that in anybody's memory, the Bank of China has actually responded to this. And believe it or not, we, in the royal sense of being people involved in this issue, had a meeting earlier this week with a representative for the Bank of China. And in fact, we may be meeting next week in London. But that is almost unprecedented. The behavior of every other player, and so far also the Bank of China, has been that this project is going ahead absolutely full blast, despite the consequences, and this is also an incredible environmental hotspot. I mean, you've got this iconic species, but also it has Sumatran tigers, it has an incredible wealth of endemic species and very high species richness. So if this is an example, I mean, if this is sort of an exemplar of the realities of what are going to play out with the Belt and Road Initiative, then I think we've actually got some really serious things to worry about, and from an environmental perspective, and from others' perspectives as well. And so I wanted to talk about some issues here. And some people will debate elements of this, and so hence the blue shirt. But Some things about the Belt and Road. One of the things is it's a lot less organized than many people realize. If you even just want to find basic information about what projects are included in the Belt and Road, if you want to try to go online and find out this information, in fact, you'll find it's oftentimes very difficult even to just figure out what is actually inside the Belt and Road and what isn't. A lot of the projects are going to be very large projects. Many are going to be multinational, transnational projects. They're going to be multiple funders. And you know what happens when you have these major projects going on? There's actually no single entity in charge. And it becomes a very difficult circumstance in which to manage and limit environmental, social, and other kinds of consequences and risks associated with that. Many of the projects, and if you look at things like the literature put out by the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, is the vision of a lot of these projects is to be transformative. Now, they say this in a very positive sense, to be transformative in sort of an economic and social sense. But in fact, the transformation is occurring, for instance, because there might be some, 5 kilometers of very difficult terrain, and because of that 5 kilometers, this entire valley and ecosystem is today completely pristine. And so their idea is to break through that bottleneck and to essentially open up this whole area to new development. So that's the vision. The nature of a lot of these projects is to be transformative in every sense. And I think that really underscores a very high level of risk from environmental and from other perspectives. And another thing to emphasize is that China has a different barometer than almost any other nation, major, certainly, OECD nation, when it comes to evaluating risks, in particular financial risks associated with projects. And there's a lot of discussion around this. Christine Lagarde of the International Monetary Fund has talked a lot about the debt traps for host nations, about the fact that the IMF believes that at least a third of the Belt and Road projects are probably not financially viable at all. That there's other kinds of agendas, geopolitical agendas that are going on here. For instance, that China may be willing to invest in very high-risk projects with a high probability of default in order to have access to natural resources or political power or, in some cases, geopolitically strategic land or ports or other kinds of resources that they could exploit in the future. There's been quite a lot of discussion along these lines. The Belt and Road has really developed as a sort of perfect storm in China. Of course, this is one of the things about China. If you talk to journalists, for instance, the international journalist associations have rated the nations of the world in terms of journalistic openness, and out of 180 nations that have been ranked, China ranks number 176 in this year's rating. So that is essentially at the absolute bottom in terms of openness of the media. And what you find with the Belt and Road project is that there is an incredible amount of both overt and passive censorship going on. So overt censorship in that the government censors and the Great Firewall will simply block any kind of negative story about the Belt and Road, but also a lot of passive censorship in the sense that things just simply don't get translated into Mandarin. And so people in mainland China just don't hear both sides of the stories about the Belt and Road. They only hear the good stuff. The Belt and Road has also, it's very much the pet project, the embodiment of President Xi Jinping, and as a consequence of his consolidation of power in China, it's been inscribed in the constitution of the Central Communist Party in China, which means it's illegal to criticize it. And this has had an incredible chilling effect on dialogue and debate within China and even among Chinese diaspora and other people living outside of China. And China is very hostile, and I say this with some experience, to criticism. I mean, and of course there's all the issues around supposedly face-saving, but also in the ways that they have operated both inside China and external to China. They have tended to operate in ways that have been very much trying to actively counter and manipulate public opinion. The BRI, again, is this signature program of President Xi Jinping, and now he is arguably going to be, he's effectively become China's leader for life if he wants to do that. Now, if you look at President Xi's proclamations about the Belt and Road, they sound wonderful. I mean, low carbon, sustainable, green, circular economy, all the, a sustainable society. You cannot be serious. 2 minutes? No, I started late. You've got to give me a little bit of extra time. There's no consensus on the eco guidelines. And what I would simply say here is that there's a lot of debate within Beijing about what the environmental guidelines are, but essentially the many hundreds, probably thousands of small companies essentially want no environmental guidelines at all. Some of the large companies that are heavily capitalized and have foreign assets do want to have some environmental guidelines, but I would argue that there's almost no way that China is going to favor strong environmental guidelines over its many foreign corporations and entrepreneurs operating overseas. And one of the key things about China is the way that they operate is that they actually overtly devolve responsibility to the host nation for enforcement and for assessment of the environmental impacts of those projects. So they're basically going to the developing nations, whether it be Democratic Republic of Congo or Brazil or Nigeria, and they're saying, you're responsible for evaluating and determining what's going on. China's corporate culture is an interesting one. There's a historical lack of financial transparency, and there's essentially been no pressure at all from the government not to have bribery. And if you go to the UK or the United States or Australia, there's legislation which is things like the Overseas Foreign Corrupt Businesses Act, which make it illegal to do have corruption and other kinds of activities. In fact, this is from Transparency International this year. No investigations or charges have ever been laid in China against its companies, citizens, or residents for foreign corrupt business practices. I mean, you can interpret that how you want, but to me, this in fact is what it essentially says. And I, having again worked for many years in countries where there is a lot of Chinese activity, I would say you see this happening and operating, playing out very much. So we're living in this modern infrastructure tsunami. What kinds of things can we do? One of the things I would really argue to an audience like this is one of the key things I think we've got to do is we have to build a very broad church. We have to talk about these projects in the broadest sense, absolutely. We've been lucky in our work to be able to talk to heads of ministries and in some cases prime ministers. But the reasons that we get in the door, and if we wanted to talk just about orangutans and elephants, we'd have about 5 minutes of their attention. But we rapidly start talking about things like votes and money and risk. And you would be amazed that suddenly the glazed over expressions, and you start talking about votes and staying in power, and you suddenly find yourself having the attention of politicians. I think we need to really talk about the economic realities of a lot of these projects. Many of these projects, many large infrastructure projects, and particularly in terms of things like alleviating pressures on poor, have turned out to be highly variable and context dependent. If you look at the literature, there's high default risks on many large infrastructure projects, and one of the things that's happening with China has been recently has been an escalation of foreign debt, and a lot of this is associated with debt with projects in which there could be defaults. What drove the last global financial crisis? It was the same thing happening in the United States. It was a rapid accumulation of debt and defaults. And the only point being here is that it's not just China taking a risk here. There's a potential for a larger set of risks that could play out, and that people need to understand this when we're talking about these kinds of tsunamis of projects. There's an enormous impact of corruption on projects. Many projects that there's no defensible cost-benefit rationale are being approved. And it's because you've got certain individuals, certain politicians and decision makers and proponents and land developers and others that stand to gain a lot. And so these projects are being approved, but oftentimes not within the public's best interest. There's also tends to be a lot of the resources, the actual funding itself, that tend to be gobbled up by cartels and others associated with construction of the project. This is just one example. Malaysia's former prime minister, it turns out, appears to have defrauded the government of something like $5 billion. All of the Belt and Road projects within peninsular Malaysia have now been canceled, which is one of the backbones of the Belt and Road, have now been canceled as a consequence of inefficiency and of this incredible financial scandal, which even has looped in poor Leonardo DiCaprio, which is one of the best guys in the planet, but he's been sucked into this incredible morass of corruption, which is now being revealed by the new government administration. One of the things I think we need to really emphasize is that the risks, when we talk about environmental risks, look, there are environmental risks, there are also social risks, economic risks, reputational risks, political risks. That is the haze from the intense fires in Southeast Asia that are happening every year. That transcends environmental risk. That has risks that closing schools, they're closing airports. Harvard University estimates that there's 100,000 people per year who are facing premature death as a result of this recurring sort of environmental crisis that's happening in Southeast Asia. One of the things that's oftentimes not being factored into a lot of these projects is the maintenance costs, which can be extremely high in high rainfall environments. And this is one of the key things. What this actually argues is that developing nations should be much more conservative and scaling down their infrastructure ambitions, but ensuring that they build into those a stream of funding so that those projects can be maintained and viable and not become stranded assets in the long term. People talk a lot about greening infrastructure for nature, and there's one of the things that you see, a lot, if you look at environmental impact assessments, and a lot of these big projects, the default is that they tend to be approved, but there's little things that we tend to do, like fish ladders, for instance, or wildlife overpasses, or other kinds of little boutique things that we tend to do, that in fact, when you look at these things objectively, oftentimes have really limited benefits. They're analogous in many cases to sort of treating cancer with a Band-Aid. And in fact, what I would argue that, in fact, one of the key things that we need to do with a lot of these infrastructure projects is that the real greening actually means screening. It means calling out and identifying a lot of these projects because they have such exceptional dangers. And for instance, this is an analysis of the 33 major development corridors in sub-Saharan Africa. These will, if they were all constructed, would span over 53,000 kilometers in length. We did an analysis and we found out only 6 of those actually had clear benefits in a cost-benefit analysis when you use transparent criteria. Okay, so a lot of these projects are being driven by agendas that nobody really understands, at least in using information that anybody can find. There's a desperate need for more strategic information, strategic planning. Most of the cases, nature is dying a death of 1,000 cuts, and when we do our environmental impact assessments, we're looking at each cut individually. And what we need to be doing is be looking at the entire panoply of these projects across the landscapes and across regions and asking what's the net effect, because that is the reality of what's happening in nature. One of the key things, absolutely key things, is this. We can go right now and we can look at these projects and we know enough to say we can just tick them off with red markers and say these things are pocked with dangers, are pocked with crises, with risks in terms of financial, economic, social, reputational, political, environmental risks. They are very heavy in terms of these projects, and we can try to the very best of our ability to tell the general publics of developing nations and to open up debates and wherever possible delay these projects. If we can just slow things down a little bit and let the publics of these sovereign nations just have an opportunity to understand what's happening, what you'll find is many of these projects will just collapse on their own. And it will be absolutely to the benefit of the developing nations and absolutely to the benefit of ecosystems and nature. Thank you.